May 8, 1945. Berlin is a wrecked shell of a city. Adolf Hitler is gone. German forces lay down their arms without conditions. After 6 relentless years of the most violent conflict in human history, the fighting across Europe finally ends. In Moscow, Stalin orders enormous celebrations. In Washington, Truman announces Victory in Europe Day. In London, Churchill speaks triumphantly to cheering crowds. The Grand Alliance has secured its victory. 3 days later, on May 11, 1945, Harry Truman signs an executive order that shocks nearly every capital in the world. He halts Lend-Lease assistance to the Soviet Union immediately. No advance notice, no consultation. American ships already moving towards Soviet ports, with supplies, are instructed to reverse course mid-voyage. Cargo vessels sitting in American harbors have their Soviet-bound freight pulled off and stacked on the docks. The immense flow of American support that had kept the Soviet war machine alive for 4 years stops at once. Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko rushes to the State Department seeking an explanation. He describes the shutdown as harsh, abrupt, and scarcely believable. In Moscow, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov tells Stalin that Truman's move amounts to economic warfare against the USSR. Stalin's reply is cold, deliberate, and calculating. They want to dictate to us. They think we need them so badly that we'll beg. Let them see that we will endure without them. The alliance that had crushed Hitler is gone. The Cold War begins almost clashing or bombs falling, but with an American president cutting off aid to a supposed ally only 3 days after their shared victory. Today, we're going to examine why Truman made this choice, what Roosevelt had promised Stalin regarding post-war assistance, and how this single action poisoned U.S.-Soviet relations and laid the foundation for 4 decades of Cold War conflict. Let's begin with what Lend-Lease actually was, because understanding the program is essential to understanding why its sudden termination was such a devastating blow to Stalin. Lend-Lease was America's method of supporting the Allied nations before entering World War II directly. Proposed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1941, the program allowed the U.S. to provide weapons, food, and industrial equipment to countries resisting the Axis powers without requiring immediate payment. It was revolutionary. Instead of selling weapons through ordinary arms deals, the United States would lend or lease supplies to allies, with repayment postponed until after the war. Roosevelt famously compared it to letting your neighbor borrow a garden hose when his house is burning down. Ad viveris. You don't negotiate the price while flames spread, you help put out the fire and settle the account later. For Britain, Lend-Lease was a lifeline. By 1941, Britain was nearly bankrupt from purchasing American arms. Without Lend-Lease, Britain might have been forced to negotiate with Hitler. Churchill called the program the most unsordid act in history. But in time, the Soviet Union became the program's largest recipient. After Germany invaded the USSR in June 1941, Soviet losses were catastrophic. May 8, 1945. Berlin is in ruins. Adolf Hitler is dead. German forces surrender unconditionally. After 6 years of the most brutal war in human history, the fighting in Europe is finally over. In Moscow, Stalin orders a massive celebration. In Washington, Truman declares Victory in Europe Day. In London, Churchill addresses cheering crowds. The Grand Alliance has won. 3 days later, May 11, 1945, the Soviet Union was fighting simply to survive and urgently needed outside assistance. Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to Moscow in November 1941. Over the next 4 years, the United States shipped the Soviets $11.3 billion worth of supplies. This included 400,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, entire factories, industrial equipment, locomotives, rail cars, explosives, and raw materials. These deliveries were vital to Soviet survival. American trucks kept Soviet armies mobile. American food prevented famine. American industrial equipment replaced factories destroyed or captured by the Germans. Stalin himself acknowledged that without American assistance, the USSR might not have survived the war's first year. By 1945, Lend-Lease equipment was deeply embedded in the Soviet war effort. Most Soviet logistical trucks were American Studebakers. Soviet transportation relied heavily on U.S.-built locomotives and railcars. Soviet soldiers consumed American canned food. Soviet industry depended on American machine tools. The Red Army that entered Berlin was significantly equipped with American supplies. Roosevelt had promised Stalin that Lend-Lease would continue after Germany's defeat. The Soviet Union was devastated, 27 million dead, countless cities destroyed, a quarter of its infrastructure obliterated, and its economy shattered. Roosevelt understood that Soviet recovery would take years and would require continued American help. He also believed that continuing aid would encourage Soviet cooperation in shaping the post-war world. If America helped rebuild the USSR, Stalin might be more willing to collaborate through the United Nations to keep global peace. This was Roosevelt's vision, a working partnership with the Soviet Union, built partly on American generosity. Stalin believed Roosevelt's assurances. Soviet planners based their post-war rebuilding strategies on the expectation that Lend-Lease supplies would continue. Stalin assumed American support would carry on, at least until Japan's defeat, and probably longer. Then Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945.
Harry Truman, who had very different instincts about Stalin, became president.
Truman's first 3 weeks in office were chaotic. He was learning about wartime agreements Roosevelt had never briefed him on. He was discovering how extensively the Soviets were violating the Yalta agreements in Eastern Europe. He was being informed about Soviet espionage inside the U.S. government. And he was forming opinions about Stalin far different from Roosevelt's more trusting approach. Truman's advisors were divided over Soviet policy. Some, like Henry Wallace and other Roosevelt loyalists, supported continuing FDR's cooperative strategy. May argued that maintaining aid would preserve the wartime alliance and encourage Soviet moderation. Cutting off aid would be seen as hostile and push Stalin toward confrontation. But other advisors, particularly U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, pushed Truman toward a tougher stance. Harriman met with Soviet officials constantly and grew increasingly frustrated with their behavior. He told Truman that Stalin was breaking agreements in Poland, Romania, and other Eastern European nations. Soviet authorities were arresting democratic leaders, rigging elections, and establishing communist-led governments. Harriman insisted that the Soviets only responded to firm pressure. If America continued to provide aid unconditionally, Stalin would interpret it as weakness and escalate his aggressive policies. Instead, Harriman argued, America should tie aid to compliance, keep Lend-Lease going only if Stalin honored his Yalta promises regarding free elections and democratic governments. Truman found this line of thinking persuasive. He already distrusted Stalin based on intelligence reports from Eastern Europe. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman had no personal connection with Stalin and no emotional stake in maintaining a cooperative alliance. Truman was a practical politician who understood leverage and bargaining power. Using American aid as a negotiating tool made sense to him. Domestic politics also played a major role. The war in Europe had ended. American taxpayers questioned why billions were still being sent overseas to a communist nation no less, when the U.S. needed to rebuild at home. Conservative members of Congress demanded that Lend-Lease be halted. They argued it made little sense to help rebuild the Soviet Union when America had its own reconstruction challenges. Military advisors added another dimension. The war with Japan was still raging. The U.S. might need to redirect supplies to the Pacific. Continuing large-scale shipments to the Soviet Union could weaken the American effort against Japan. This offered a practical justification for cutting the program beyond political calculation. De Brilliant de Hue, all of this pushed Truman toward a dramatic decision. On May 11, 1945, Just 3 days after Victory in Europe Day, Truman signed Executive Order 9555, ending Lend-Lease for all nations not still fighting Japan. Because the war in Europe was over, this meant an abrupt cutoff for the Soviet Union, Britain, and other European allies. But the way the order was carried out turned it into something far more explosive. The implementation was startlingly sudden. The State Department immediately notified American ports to stop loading Soviet ships. Vessels already in transit were told to return to U.S. shores. According to some accounts, a ship that had barely left New York Harbor was ordered to turn around, and its cargo destined for the USSR was unloaded back onto the dock. This level of abruptness was never the intended plan. The administration had expected a gradual phase-out, but lower-level bureaucrats interpreted the executive order literally and enforced it as an instant shutdown. Ships reversed course before anyone could fully understand how shockingly hostile the move would appear to Moscow. When Soviet Ambassador Gromyko learned what was happening, he was stunned.
Free. He rushed to the State Department, demanding an immediate meeting with Secretary of State Edward Stettinius.
Gromyko was typically calm and composed, but this time his anger was unmistakable. He described the cutoff as ruthless, saying it would be viewed as a deliberate humiliation of the Soviet Union at the very moment of its greatest sacrifice and triumph. He emphasized the timing just 3 days after VE Day. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million lives, defeating Hitler. Soviet cities were charred ruins. Millions were hungry. And right as the victory celebrations were ending, America cut off aid without warning. How could such an act be interpreted as anything but hostility? The Truman administration scrambled to offer explanation. They insisted the decision wasn't targeted at the Soviet Union specifically.
Britain and other allies were also affected.
They argued that the Lend-Lease law required termination when the emergency in Europe ended. It was, they claimed, a legal necessity, nothing more. But almost nobody believed that justification. Yes, Britain was unhappy, but London understood the political logic. Moscow, however, took it personally. Stalin interpreted the move as Truman choosing this exact moment to demonstrate American dominance and Soviet dependence. The Soviet response came swiftly and on multiple fronts. Publicly, Soviet newspapers condemned American capitalists who sought to profit from Soviet suffering. Pravda published pieces accusing the U.S. of imperialism and economic pressure. The message to the Soviet population was unmistakable. America was no longer an ally. Privately, Stalin's reaction was much more strategic. He told his advisors that Truman's decision was an attempt to use economic pressure to influence Soviet policy. Stalin vowed not to bend. He ordered Soviet planners to create reconstruction programs that assumed zero American aid. The USSR would rebuild independently, even if that meant slower recovery and greater hardship for its people. Stalin also intensified actions in Eastern Europe. If the U.S. was going to treat the Soviet Union as an adversary, then the USSR needed a buffer zone of loyal governments. Communist consolidation advanced rapidly. Free elections in Poland were pushed aside indefinitely. Opposition parties in Romania and Bulgaria were dealt with more aggressively. Soviet military occupation increasingly transformed into direct political control. Back in Washington, Truman's advisors quickly realized that the execution of the cutoff, rather than the decision itself, was the real catastrophe. The suddenness created unnecessary hostility. Within days, Truman modified the order to permit delivery of supplies already produced or en route. But the diplomatic damage was irreversible. Stalin had received the message Truman intended, and he reacted exactly as Truman had not anticipated. The Lend-Lease cutoff carried major consequences beyond immediate U.S.-Soviet relations. It shaped Stalin's attitude at the upcoming Potsdam Conference scheduled for July. Roosevelt had promised continued aid. Truman had abruptly withdrawn it. Rout the Lang in Phoenicia.
Stalin came to Potsdam deeply skeptical of American promises.
Negotiations began under a cloud of distrust. The cutoff also influenced Soviet policy toward Japan. At Yalta, Roosevelt had persuaded Stalin to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat. Stalin honored that exact timeline, declaring war on Japan on August 8, 1945, precisely 3 months after VE Day. But the Lend-Lease shutdown changed Stalin's posture in Asia. Since American aid was no longer expected, Stalin pursued harsher territorial demands. Soviet occupation of Manchuria, northern Korea, and former Japanese territories became more extractive, driven by Stalin's belief that the USSR must secure resources on its own. Then, the atomic bomb transformed everything. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Stalin learned that the U.S. had developed a weapon capable of erasing entire cities, and had not informed him during development. Combined with the Lend-Lease termination, Stalin interpreted this as confirmation that America was preparing for confrontation rather than cooperation. He immediately pushed the Soviet atomic program into overdrive. Stalin ordered Soviet scientists to develop a nuclear bomb at any cost, demanding speed over everything else. Soviet espionage operations intensified dramatically, targeting American nuclear secrets. The nuclear arms race began because Stalin believed he needed atomic weapons simply to balance U.S. power. Some historians argue that Truman's Lend-Lease decision, more than even the atomic bomb, convinced Stalin that peaceful cooperation with America was impossible. Nuclear weapons were understandable from a military standpoint, but cutting off aid to a wrecked ally 3 days after shared victory was a political act. And Stalin read it as deliberate hostility. Could Truman have handled the situation differently? The A.S. Continue aid temporarily while negotiating conditions. Prefer expansion of your Hilcopius also yo willax benocaris. May 8, 1945. Berlin is in ruins. Adolf Hitler is dead. German forces surrender unconditionally. After 6 years of the most brutal war in human history, the fighting in Europe is finally over. In Moscow, Stalin orders a massive celebration. In Washington, Truman declares Victory in Europe Day. In London, Churchill addresses cheering crowds. The Grand Alliance has won. Provide advance notice to Stalin. Use diplomatic channels before implementing changes. Any of these choices would have been less inflammatory. They still would have signaled that the United States expected Soviet cooperation, but without the humiliation caused by turning cargo ships around in mid-ocean. Why then didn't Truman choose a softer approach? Part of the reason was inexperience. He had been president for less than a month. Part was poor advice from officials who misjudged Stalin's psychology. Part was pressure from Congress to appear tough on communism. And part was genuine frustration at Soviet violations in Eastern Europe. Truman believed Stalin needed to be confronted firmly. Cutting off aid was his way of sending that message. But Truman miscalculated badly. Stalin did not respond to pressure by moderating his behavior. Instead, he became more defiant and more hostile. For Stalin, independence mattered more than American support. He preferred to rebuild alone, no matter how long it took, rather than accept American conditions. Roosevelt had understood this element of Stalin's personality. He knew Stalin was deeply suspicious and proud, and would not react well to pressure. Roosevelt's strategy was to build trust through cooperation, extend aid, help with reconstruction, make Stalin feel secure, and gradually encourage collaboration. Would Roosevelt's strategy have succeeded? It will never be known. He died before it could be tested in peacetime. But what is known is that Truman's method did not produce cooperation. The Lend-Lease cutoff deepened hostility, accelerated confrontation, and played a major role in strengthening Stalin's control over Eastern Europe. And the irony is that Truman later adopted a version of Roosevelt's own cooperative strategy through something entirely different: the Marshall Plan. In 1947, Truman proposed massive American financial support to rebuild Europe. The Marshall Plan ultimately sent $13 billion to Western European countries, allowing them to recover economically, stabilize political systems, and resist communist influence. However, the Marshall Plan was deliberately withheld from the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Truman offered it only to nations willing to accept free market reforms and democratic institutions. Stalin refused the offer immediately and forced Eastern European governments to reject it as well. That refusal cemented Europe's division into East and West. But imagine a different scenario. Suppose Truman had extended a modified version of Lend-Lease to the USSR in 1945, aid for reconstruction tied to economic reforms or reasonable political conditions. That may have offered Stalin a way to cooperate without humiliation. It could have provided a diplomatic bridge rather than an abrupt cutoff. Instead, the Lend-Lease termination in May 1945, followed by the Marshall Plan in 1947, sent a very clear message. America would help its friends and withhold help from those it saw as adversaries. That is distasteful. The human consequences of this decision are impossible to fully measure. The Cold War brought proxy wars, enormous stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and decades of global tension.
Soviet domination over Eastern Europe caused vast suffering.
Europe remained divided for nearly half a century. To Stalin, the Lend-Lease cutoff became symbolic a sign that America had never truly been an ally, only a temporary partner against a shared enemy. Once Hitler was defeated, Stalin believed America revealed its real intention. He told his inner circle later that the Lend-Lease shutdown convinced him that the U.S. had always planned to oppose the Soviet Union once the war ended. Truman eventually admitted that the execution of the cutoff had been handled poorly. In his memoirs, he wrote that the implementation was too sudden and should have been better managed. But he defended the underlying principle of using aid as leverage. Truman believed Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe justified a firm U.S. response. Historians continue to debate his decision. Some believe Truman was right to confront Stalin quickly, and that only the method was flawed. Others argue Roosevelt's cooperative strategy should have been extended long enough to see whether it could build lasting trust. Still others say the clash was inevitable, that Stalin's ideology and actions would have triggered conflict no matter what the U.S. did. What is certain is that May 11, 1945, marked a pivotal turning point. The day Truman ended Lend-Lease was the day the Grand Alliance effectively collapsed. The American-Soviet partnership, already strained, shifted decisively toward rivalry. The Cold War didn't begin with Churchill's Iron Curtain speech or with the Berlin blockade. It began when American ships turned back across the ocean carrying supplies Stalin believed were guaranteed. Those supplies weren't ordinary aid, they were promises. Promises Roosevelt had made, promises Soviet planners relied on, promises Stalin considered essential for rebuilding his devastated nation. When those promises were withdrawn abruptly, Stalin saw it as a deliberate act of economic coercion. Stalin and his advisors called it economic warfare. Some Soviet officials even compared it to a declaration of war. Stock. Me porten by the plow. These weren't empty claims. The Lend-Lease termination signaled that the wartime alliance was truly over and that a new era of confrontation had begun. And in Hagdainas to the Soviets, Madala fienda mintrified. And it happened just 3 days after the shared triumph over Nazi Germany. Although, at the very moment when cooperation should have been strongest, trust collapsed instead. Harry Truman, less than a month into his presidency, made a bold decision that reversed Roosevelt's policy of careful cooperation. He chose confrontation over conciliation. He used economic pressure to influence Stalin's decisions, and he set into motion the chain of events that defined global politics for the next 40 years. Whether Truman's decision was wise or misguided, courageous or reckless, practical or naive, its consequences endured for generations. That is why May 11, 1945 matters, not only as the date a major wartime program ended, but as the moment America's new president chose a direction that reshaped the world.
A direction that ended the fragile partnership with the Soviet Union.
a direction Stalin never forgave. The abrupt cutoff of Lend-Lease on May 11, 1945, didn't simply end a wartime program. It destroyed the last strands of trust between Washington and Moscow. And for Stalin, the moment was unforgettable.
It confirmed every suspicion he had ever held about Western intentions.
He believed the United States had waited until Germany was defeated and then immediately turned to weaken the Soviet Union economically. To him, this was the real beginning of the post-war struggle, confrontation already underway before any speeches, diplomatic clashes, or territorial disputes. For American officials, the move was framed as a legal necessity, a wartime program ending because the emergency in Europe was over. But for the Soviet leadership, it was interpreted through the lens of national trauma. The USSR had just endured unimaginable losses. Entire cities were flattened.
Millions of families had been torn apart.
And right when rebuilding was most urgent, the United States abruptly ended the supply line that had been promised for the post-war period. This wasn't merely a logistical setback, it was a political shockwave. Soviet planners who had built their reconstruction strategies around continued aid suddenly had to rewrite everything. Factories that depended on American machine tools faced shortages.
The transportation network, heavily reliant on U.S.-supplied trucks and locomotives, had to operate with dwindling resources.
Food supplies that had helped feed both civilians and soldiers were no longer guaranteed. The message Moscow received was not that a program had ended, but that the United States no longer cared whether the Soviet Union recovered or collapsed. From this, Stalin drew a conclusion that shaped his entire post-war foreign policy. America would help nations it hoped to influence, and it would deprive those it considered rivals. Thus, from Stalin's perspective, the Soviet Union was officially a rival from May 11th onward. This belief hardened Soviet behavior across Eastern Europe. Instead of experimenting with mixed governments or limited pluralism, Stalin accelerated the creation of fully controlled communist regimes. Any remaining cooperation with non-communist parties evaporated. Elections became tools of domination rather than diplomacy. Opposition leaders vanished. The buffer zones Stalin wanted for security became an empire of tightly controlled satellite states.
And at the core of these actions was the conviction that the United States had already chosen a path of hostility.
Meanwhile, in the United States, Truman's administration saw the Soviet reaction as proof that Stalin was untrustworthy and expansionist. The harsher Stalin behaved, the more justified American officials felt in their suspicion. Thus, each side interpreted the other's moves as confirmation of their worst fears. The cycle of mistrust deepened rapidly. Soon afterward, events continued to escalate. The Berlin crisis, the formation of NATO, Soviet nuclear testing, and the consolidation of communist rule in Eastern Europe all emerged from this growing divide. But beneath all of these later events lay the root cause: the collapse of the fragile wartime understanding between the two nations. In retrospect, the Lend-Lease cutoff became a symbolic moment, endlessly debated by historians. Some argue it was simply a bureaucratic decision carried out too quickly. Others see it as Truman's first major foreign policy mistake blunder that pushed Stalin into a defensive, paranoid posture. Still others believe conflict was inevitable due to ideological incompatibility, and the cutoff merely accelerated what would have unfolded anyway. What cannot be disputed is the impact it had on Stalin's thinking. For him, the cutoff confirmed that the United States intended to isolate, pressure, and perhaps even dominate the Soviet Union. And because Stalin viewed world politics in zero-sum terms, he responded with equal determination. He increased military spending, tightened control over Eastern Europe, and intensified espionage against the West. The seeds of the nuclear arms race were planted in these months of distrust. So were the diplomatic tensions that later shaped the Korean War, the Berlin airlift, and the long shadow of the Iron Curtain. Truman's supporters argued that standing firm against Stalin early was necessary, that any sign of weakness would have encouraged Soviet expansion. They believed Truman's decision was a needed correction to Roosevelt's overly optimistic approach. On the other hand, critics contend that Roosevelt's strategy of extending trust and maintaining cooperation might have eased tensions if continued just a little longer. A gradual reduction of aid handled with diplomacy might have preserved some measure of goodwill. We will never know whether that path could have prevented or delayed the Cold War. What we do know is that Truman's choice ensured the clash emerged immediately, sharply, and irreversibly. And so May 11, 1945, became more than a date on the calendar. It became the dividing line between two eras: wartime cooperation and peacetime rivalry. It marked the moment when both nations stopped viewing each other as partners of necessity and began treating each other as adversaries with competing visions for the future. The ships that turned around in the Atlantic symbolized a turning point in global politics. Their unsent cargo became a metaphor for broken promises and the collapse of trust. The Soviet leadership never forgot it. Stalin never forgave it. And the world lived with the consequences for nearly half a century. This is why the end of Lend-Lease on May 11th matters, not because crates of equipment stayed on American docks, but because the decision shaped the mindset of the leaders who defined the second half of the 20th century. It marked the moment when the grand wartime alliance finally dissolved. It was the first shot of a new conflict. Not a military one, but a geopolitical and ideological struggle that engulfed the world. The Cold War did not begin with speeches or blockades, but with a presidential order that arrived at the worst possible moment. And long after the war ended, long after borders solidified and new world orders emerged, Stalin's resentment remained. He carried it through every negotiation, every confrontation, and every decision that followed. The consequences of that single decision, made by a new president still learning the world, lasted for generations.